welcome Bina as she introduces our panel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bina. Really excited to be here with you today and also with a few guests who will be introducing themselves in just a moment. So, we're here today to talk about equity in everyday action and what that looks like when we're committed to it in full and then the day to day work of our day to day jobs, life, community work. We show up really committed to equity. And so, certainly, with what's been happening with the pandemic, the racial justice movements around the US and Canada and globally, we're seeing this move and call to action for allies, for activists, for all of us to find a way to show up. And what's really important, just to offer a few words of framing before we get into our conversation here, um, when I talk about equity in everyday action, what I mean is that it's not a headline. It's just how we be in this work, how we're willing to show up and try in this work. And so importantly, it's to understand that equity work doesn't show up in a plan. And it's not just a moment. It's been unfolding now for years. And the most important lesson there is that the opportunity to do equity work is eternally available right now. It's endlessly available. There are opportunities in front of us every day to make choices, to think about what we've learned, our worldview, who we include, who we learn from, who we listen to, who has wisdom for us, to think about those choices in our day to day work all the time. And so what's amazing about that is when it's available to us, it really gives us the chance to create a sustained daily practice. And that's what's going to change the world, is that we all commit to showing up every day, even when we don't get it right and we're uncertain, but we're willing each day to keep moving forward. So equity in everyday action also means that in our day-to-day practice, we're willing to challenge some of the norms, to be curious about where did I learn this from? And is it serving us? Is it serving the collective good, or does it serve me and certain communities only, or my family, or people like me only? That we are willing to check in about what appears to be normal and really have an inquiry about are there other ways of showing up here? Is there other wisdom? Is there other language? Are there other points of view? And the real practice here is the negotiation of the diversity of ideas and views. In the day-to-day work, we're really trying to break our own echo chambers and that space that's held by a lot of similar thinking and similar experiences. And instead, we learn to practice different forms of communication, of building knowledge, of solving conflicts. And we do this together and we negotiate what this new space looks like when we make it bigger. The last thing about equity in everyday action is that even when it's most challenging, when we're most exhausted, when we're unsure, when there's no resources, when there's no allies, when we haven't been given permission, when we're not sure of exactly the right next step, we're still willing to move forward. And the critical piece here in the equity work, what we mean by equity is that we're trying to establish a bigger space in which individuals who have historically and traditionally been given a marginalized identity have a space to share their ways of expression, their ways of doing life, their ways of feeling their own power, and really directing for themselves, their families, and their resources what solutions look like in the long term. And so to do the equity work means that even if we're uncertain, we try. And even if we make a mistake, we say sorry and we move on. But that we take it away from this flash in the pan, it has to be a big thing, to I will consistently show up, to choose the collective over just my own interest. And so most critically, what we always hear about this is it's a journey, right? It's step by step every day. There's pathways, there's things to explore, things to learn, and things to unlearn. And so it's not a one moment thing, and it's not a one book or a book club or one training. The work of equity really requires a lifelong commitment in all of the spaces we show up, and really personally to say, where am I in this journey? And how am I contributing to the collective good, to a bigger vision? How can I hold a vision even when it's really hard and there's no one with me, or it feels like we might be losing the battle here, or we're unsure of what all of it looks like, but the vision is we know there's something better for all of us than what's happening today. And so in this space, I'm excited to bring in two colleagues and friends to talk about their journeys and their experiences and have a conversation for the next bit of time. And hopefully it opens up some learning of what it looks like when we all step into this space. So Emily and Marisa, hello, and thank you so much for showing up and being willing to share your journeys and be with us in this. I'm so grateful for what you do every day and that you're willing to open it up to others. So looking forward to this conversation. And Marisa, I'm going to actually ask you first to introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Emily. Oh, you're muted, I think. Are you muted?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Bina and Emily and everyone for inviting me to this conversation. My name is Marisa Quiroz, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at the International Community Foundation. I have a picture that I can show to share with you a little bit about who I am and my family's history. So this picture that you see in front of you is one of my favorites in my family. It represents 5 generations of women. This picture was taken in the 1950s in San Bernardino, California. The little girl is my mom. Standing above her, the woman in the light sweater, is my grandmother. Next to her is my grandmother's mother. Sitting down below is my grandmother's mother's mother, and my grandmother's mother's mother's mother is sitting next to her. So I look at this picture often as a reminder of who I come from. You know, my daughter is the 7th generation firstborn daughter in this line. And these are the women that taught me how to live, how to survive in a world that didn't always accept their presence. And they also taught me how important relationships are. And so to echo the message that Bina, you just shared with us, it is about the collective. And that's something that my grandmothers instilled in me at a very young age.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Amazing. Emily, welcome.
Thank you. So I'm Emily Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. And I'd also like to share an image. So this is, you'll see my mother and dad and my 3 sisters. I'm the baby in the family that my mother's holding. We're in Africa. That's where I lived with my family the first year of my life. And I really wanted to say something about my mother and the strong role of women in my family as well. You'll see my dad was really lucky. I was supposed to be a boy, but it didn't turn out that way. My mother, you know, at this age, she didn't have that many. She had a lot of aspirations. She had gotten a master's degree, and my dad had gotten his PhD. But the option she had was to go into education or nursing. So she got a degree in education, but then she got pregnant. So she had 4 kids. So she really couldn't do anything until I was 7. She ended up getting involved in the neighborhood to save the local school, and then ended up going on and into politics. And she became a county supervisor. She became a highway commissioner. She ended up eventually becoming a state legislator for 12 years. And what I think is really interesting, and I think about it for this conversation today, is all along the way, you know, she was a woman first, you know, a first woman doing this, or among a few women in the legislature. and, you know, working on legislation that frankly affected women and girls, and was really interested in criminal justice as well. But, you know, all along the way, she was stereotyped and pigeonholed as a woman. I remember whenever there were women's issues, she'd have to dress up in a dress with the other women in the legislature to make her point and look non-threatening. And I think about that now when people talk about, you know, being seen as just as a hue, a skin color, and how we do that. We've been socialized to do that. That's you know, the social construction of race. Another thing is she was criticized for being too abrasive, you know, having strong opinions, because she was a woman, and the way she spoke out, it would sound different as a man. Think about that now, you know, with just the unwritten rules of white dominant spaces, and kind of a white-centered world, and how that must be to experience that. And then lastly, you know, my dad was very supportive of her going into politics, but she still had to clean the house and take care of all the 4 girls. So I had chores starting at the age of 7. But, you know, think about that with this whole issue of equity and inequity, when you have to start from behind and you have to do 3 times as much just to get to the level playing field. And it really inspires me to think deeply about this issue that we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emily. Beautiful and amazing what our mothers have done for us, for sure, and our fathers. And certainly, we are the wildest dreams of our ancestors in so many ways, right? And so the commitment to carry onwards and bigger and better for each other and our families is what we're here to do. So thank you for sharing who you are, not just what you do and the roles you play. I appreciate that. So, you know, in putting this session together, this idea of equity and how is it showing up in the world right now, and I thought, who else can help us learn together? And so I thought of you both. And so as we jump into this, and also just getting to the place of what the journey feels like, and being open and honest and transparent and vulnerable about it, I would love to hear what it felt like to be asked to join this panel and this conversation, or just kind of how you're coming into this conversation, and give us a little context. And so, Emily, I'll start with you there.
Well, I'll say I come in with a bit of trepidation, in the sense that this is a very difficult and painful thing to talk about personally. It's not something that I talked about a ton as a kid, and in some ways I didn't have the language. And it's also something I feel overwhelmed by and a little over my head at times. And then I feel super heartbroken about the more I open my eyes and see things and look at the state of where we are today. It really breaks my heart, and it kicks up a lot of other emotions.
Yeah, thank you. I feel that. Yeah. Marisa, how about you? How does it feel to join this public chat?
I can feel the trepidation as well. You know, I started this conversation sharing a little bit about my grandmothers, and one of the things my mom's mom always told me was that you have to go where you're not expected to be. And so when things feel a little bit uncomfortable, it's probably because you should be there. And so I had that immediate feeling, because how could I possibly capture the grief that our nation, that our country's feeling, the pain, and how could I possibly share with you? What could I say to tell you about the love and the rage that is that people are holding at the same time right now in this moment? And so I am here because my ancestors have sent me, and I am standing between my ancestors and future ancestors, right? And that is why I said yes to. And it's my way of encouraging all of you to show up too, even when it's hard and feels uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. You know, I feel that, and like thinking about how we show up for this. And I think one reason I really wanted to be in conversation with you was personally, I show up to this also with trepidation, but overwhelm and exhaustion, and increasingly feeling like I just don't know. And trying to undo the idea of what expert or like person with the title who's supposed to know all this looks like. And so I really appreciate being in an alliance and relationship with you, because I think that makes even this space, but the journey to your point in this moment of all of the feelings and all of the uncertainty, but also the wisdom that we do have, so much more powerful because it feels real. So thank you. So Marisa, I'd love to hear a bit about your journey in racial equity, which is a huge question. So feel free just to share kind of what it's felt like or what it's been, or some of the pivotal moments along the way that helped define your journey.
It is a really big question. And part of why I really struggled with how to answer it is because the path also chose me. I didn't just choose the journey or the path. And I think there are those of us that don't get a choice. We're faced with having to figure this out because we've had experiences that have caused us to dig a little deeper so that we can understand and make it. And there are ways that I have absolutely raised my hand to learn more about the experiences I've had. And so, growing up, I had a very socially active grandmother who was politically active and so aware. She exposed us to so many things. Took us into nature to experience national parks, took us to the free museum days to understand art history. And, she really provided a full range of opportunities for us. It wasn't until really high school that I started to realize that the things and the stories that my family had been teaching me, it wasn't being reflected in the curricula for school. And I realized that there was a problem with that without having yourself reflected in your education, without understanding unique history of activism or even just health disparities, there was a lot of unlearning that and I hadn't learned all of it yet, but I had to already understand that there was an element of unlearning that had to happen. And I think in high school is when I really experienced what I've shared before with both of you, that it was a time to be proud of being Latina, of growing up in the border region, of having these experiences where I was of both neither, and that there was a point of pride that was afforded to me in that space. And I remember having a lot of discussions with friends and family around race at that time, in trying to understand my own race and understanding that race doesn't really exist in some way, and that no matter what I would do or say, that perceptions were already determined for me. And I would have to figure out how to navigate that in my career, in my life, and for my family. So these are just some of the early things that I learned about race pretty young.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, right? Growing up being named a person of colors, because the experiences are so present for us, which isn't always the case in spaces of white identities, where you might not grow up thinking about race or being confronted with those dynamics. And if I can add, and then Emily, I'd love to hear kind of what you've had to unlearn in your journey here. But for me, it started standing on the street in India, in Bombay, with my dad, while my sisters and mom were shopping. And we saw kids in deep poverty that lived under the train station platform. And I remember looking at my dad and saying, so who's supposed to help them? Like, where is everybody? Like, when are they coming to help? And I remember standing there as a kid. I was 7. And it took me a long time of looking at my black hair and this little kid who looked just like me, whose hair was orange, because he was malnourished. And like, I couldn't make sense of why he looked the same and different, and where the helpers were. So I feel like similarly, it's been a journey, even though I didn't always have the names for it, to always question, how do we help? Like, this part is not okay. What's going on here? This isn't normal. And I feel like the language has changed, which is an interesting part of this journey of like how you be it, even though the broader context might change, but that you're always learning through the work. So yeah, what you said resonated and just brought to mind my sweet dad. So Emily, how has your journey been unfolding?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and it was a very white and segregated community, although we did have Black neighbors. And I grew up also in a very academic household. My dad was a professor. He was a professor of African politics, focused on politics of cultural pluralism. And I just tell you that because we had a lot of academic discussions at the table, and that along with a lot about politics. And so I grew up, when we had a lot of people, a lot of students, international students from Africa that would come to dinner, we'd have them over. And so I grew up, and my whole thought process about racism and inequality, it was very abstract. And so I learned it in school. And I also grew up, and I don't know where it came from, but I know I grew up with a lot of white guilt. And also this feeling that I was not a racist and that color blindness was very important. I remember that, like, I don't remember my parents telling me that, but I think about that, like those were ever present in my mind. And I hear other people of my generation talk about, well, I'm colorblind, even though it's not true. And I remember kind of struggling with that, thinking, well, secretly inside I thought, well, I'm not really colorblind. I see everybody. Like, it's one of the first things I go to is you kind of classify people in different ways. But anyway, like Bina, it was when I lived abroad. I spent years abroad. I lived as a high school exchange student in Ecuador, and then in Peru for a year, where I met my husband as an undergrad. And then as a graduate student, I lived for a couple of years in Mexico. And in all those places, I saw deep inequality and a social hierarchy that also followed a racial hierarchy, where the darker your skin, the lower you were on the socioeconomic ladder. And it was a product of colonization, which I also learned about in high school and college. It was always still very abstract to me, although like Bina, I remember when I went to Ecuador, my first day there, I just started crying when I was, looking out of the bus, and I see what I saw with this incredible poverty was something I'd never seen before. I grew up in the Midwest, very protected. And so it was the beginning of my unlearning, just seeing that, opening my eyes to the world around me and seeing that inequality is all around, and that there was something going on where I was in a very affluent place where I was from. And there was a connection between my affluence and the poverty somewhere else. And then where it became much more real was when I actually, I landed a job. It's a long circuitous path, but I ended up here in San Diego with my husband, and I started a job at the San Diego Foundation, and working with many donors that acquired great wealth and wanted to give back, and working with different communities where we were giving. I really saw that kind of disparity, and it was more personal, those interactions, and more deeply, I was in an environment program that's very historically, I think there's a lot more out in the news about it, but the American conservation movement has very racist roots in some ways. And I remember when we were developing our program, really looking at, issues of environmental justice for the first time. And there was a disconnect between efforts to protect and connect natural lands and then these environmental justice issues, looking at tribal lands where we'd stole, white people, and we stole Kumeyaay land and the land of others. We imposed government, religion, took away language. We did all sorts of things. And all of that, it was much more firsthand and deeply personal. And my eyes were further opened up, actually through the Environmental Grantmakers Association and Bina's training. And I've undergone a lot of training that's really helped me as somebody that identifies white to open my eyes and live with the discomfort of kind of saying, oh, wow, actually, I was socialized to be racist because I see skin color and I associate certain things. And I have these privileges that actually I grew up taking for granted. And it worked for me, and not fully appreciating the privilege that I had because I didn't have to. And I think that journey has continued at USD. Obviously, there's a lot of foment on campus. We're a campus that's located on Kumeyaay lands. And there's also a lot of concern among students and faculty about, structural racism and how that plays out on a college campus. And so we're working through a lot of that. And all of it has really helped me become much more aware and realize that it is a lifelong journey of things that I now have to unlearn. And it's more than that. It's activating myself and standing up and finding ways to really redress this 500 years of history.
Yeah, powerful. Thank you. Gosh, that was a lot of things, Emily. I so appreciate deepening the context of privilege and awareness. And I appreciate that both of you brought forward the connection of the personal with experiences that create awareness and even maybe some discomfort in that process of unlearning, but also what it looks like in the day-to-day work and the world around us, in education and environmental work, in missions. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about maybe what are some of the experiences that you look to as moments where you were like, this is unlearning. This is how we show up, and maybe they were different, and kind of what that looks like, and really how this lands for you in your day-to-day practice. Like, what does it look like for you to do your equity work, and what experiences have led you to kind of take those moments and bring them with you every day? Emily, do you want to start? And then Marisa, either way.
I did a lot of talking before, but I'll just say one thing that Marisa and I went through together. Actually, we went through a lot of different things together. And you're a dear friend, Marisa, and I feel lucky to have gone through them with you. I was thinking about one of the times we crossed the border together, and we got pulled over to secondary, and I was with Marisa and another dear colleague of ours, Kymaani Vasi, who's from Detroit, actually. We got pulled over even though we had sentry cards for kind of a fast pass to get across. And I found that I was like immediately just indignant, thinking, I can't believe we were pulled over secondary. And it was one of those moments where now they have that term Karen kind of behavior. And I have to admit, I was thinking, gosh, what am I, like at the time I didn't have that name for it, but I was thinking, what am I doing acting all huffy puffy privileged? I'm going to get Marisa and Kymaani and me in trouble because the Border Patrol doesn't care what we think. But I that stuck with me. And Marisa, I remember she told me at the time that, to get through this, we're going to have to learn helplessness. We're going to have to really sink into that emotion to get through this. We're stranded, and she had to be back with her little baby boy. So that, I don't know, Marisa, if you want to share from your perspective what happened.
Yeah, I remember that day, and we were racing to get Kymaani back to a flight, and we were racing because at the time I was nursing my infant son, and he had been all day My mom was calling me because there was no more milk in the fridge to warm up for him. So there, that's the added drama to this story. I remember thinking, I've been to secondary before, and I've been to secondary for 2 hours, and I've been there for 7 hours. And I knew that I could not be there for 7 hours on this night. So as soon as I saw Emily, if you wanna put yourself to the test, go through the borderline and get yourself into secondary and see how everyone in the car reacts, right? Who thinks you have a right to push back and say, no, excuse me, actually, we have to be served first because we gotta go. We have a baby to feed, and it was interesting to even observe my own reaction in that moment, which was, okay, the more noise I make, the longer I'm going to be here, the more we will be punished. The better thing is to just not say. I had to remind myself, these people who are working here, these Border Patrol, they're not who I'm going to take this up with. I just need to get through this moment. And Emily's about to get us here for 8 hours. We're going to be here for a long time if Emily actually starts to try to demand special treatment, So it is that, things that people learn in their lives of how to behave and when. And, as we were talking about how we learn about these things or not learn about these things, it's true. We don't have a language, we're not taught that these conversations should be rigorous with the stamina to have the conversations, which is why it can feel so edgy to talk about them. And that's something that I would encourage everyone to try to work through. It is going to be raggedy because we haven't been taught these tools. But they do exist, and you can do the work to better understand yourself through this lens. I also just want to share that, the colorblind piece, I remember, people saying that to me as a way to comfort me, as a way to say, no, actually, I'm colorblind, we're cool. But it was actually so painful because it dismissed the pain that I was experiencing. People's being colorblind dismisses the pain that others are experiencing within a system that uplifts some, and by design keeps others not uplifted.
Yeah, well said. And it dismisses the beauty we bring, right? The richness of our backgrounds, our languages, our practices, our wisdom that doesn't come from a white dominant, Christian, hetero, patriarchal, European background, right? And when people say we're colorblind, it dismisses the richness that's available. Similarly to this idea of the melting pot is I don't want to melt. It's cool. I want to add, I want to be a vibrant ingredient in something much more interesting than a bunch of melty stuff where you can't tell the difference between anyone. And I think that's another part of the unlearning is that difference means conflict. Because difference and acknowledging that there's racial identities and ethnic and all these things can really bring a richness if we're willing to do this daily work of making the circle bigger, not smaller, right? Not forcing conformity and making women wear dresses and only women speak on this issue in certain ways, and that white people don't have a place in racial equity work. Because white people have a race. They do. And so they do have a place. And, really working to make this a more open, transparent place where we are in the struggle and the joy of it together is so essential. One of the things I've had to unlearn is that it has to be hard. It's hard for some, and it's emotional in moments, and it's exhausting, like right now, all the time. but it can be really joyful to challenge the status quo, right? And be like, I see something bigger and I'm going to help people. Like, there is so much liberation in doing the work of liberation and being a truth teller. And so over the years, I have found one of my big unlearnings is how I approach this work. And so in our last few minutes and a couple of questions, I'd love to hear from each of you. What is one of your daily practices that you lean on to advance equity? And the second question for each of you, what's your call to action for folks who are listening to us today? Whoever wants to start can start. I won't call on you this time.
I'll start because I think one of the reasons why you chose Emily and I to have this conversation, Bina, is because, Emily and I have worked really successfully on DEI overtly and covertly in our paths together. And we've done it from different angles at different times. Sometimes we've talked about what you're going to say and what I'm going to say. And other times we stepped up and stepped down, depending on who had the energy and who had the force adequately kept that day, So I have a lot of hope in that working together, having these conversations is moving the needle. And that's hard to see at a time when there is so much grieving and pain. It's hard to say that there's hope when you see the rage and the anger. And I think my call to action is that, we've tried for many years to get people to connect intellectually with the data. Here are the disparities. Here's the zip code study on health. Here's what you need to know about these terms, or, there's empirical evidence that says X, Y, and Z. We have attempted to connect with people intellectually. And I think for some it's been effective. And what I'm asking is for now you to connect with your hearts around this, that is actually what is required. And it's love for each other. Emily and I have worked on some sticky ones together with, regional initiatives and multiple stakeholders and, people who are funding solutions and people who are leading solutions. And I think there's been a lot of learning there. And I think I would like to ask that we connect now with our hearts. We connect emotionally to this issue to try to understand our role in helping to advance humanity around this. I think, I have a lot of hope. I see a lot of young people from all walks of life that understand that what's happening in our nation is that it doesn't have to be this way, that we can work together and that it can we can tell a different story. So I'm really hoping that what we're learning with the pandemic, what we're how it's bringing to light systematic oppression, and that we will connect emotionally and be able to really advance this conversation in new ways.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you. Emily, what's one of your daily practices and your call to action for folks that are listening?
I think my daily practice is to really challenge myself in an ongoing way and be humble about it, even though it's really hard. And when I feel defensive, to recognize that I'm feeling defensive, that I'm going to learn something from that. And also to know that's not enough. It's not just the personal work, the cumulative impact of this. And just the more and more you see all these different kinds of policies and the way we invest private and public money that, produces and reproduces and perpetuates and makes more pervasive racial injustice. I think it's important to be aware of that. And I think about that a lot and realize that it's not enough for me to just be aware. but I have to do more in the work that I do and how I show up in the world, and how I'm there for others. And then another thing I would say, I really loved what Marisa said about the heart. I wholeheartedly agree. The way I've really been able to, I think, more deeply engage in this is just thinking about, we're a human family and we need to be decent to one another and treat one another with dignity. And some people don't feel loved. They don't feel included, and they have been systematically excluded and oppressed. And it's an injustice that hasn't been redressed or even acknowledged. And in your own family, if you felt like that with a sibling, that would be a horrible, horrible feeling. This is something that we've done over centuries. And the last thing I'd say is I like Marisa, I have deep hope. I think that we have a much greater collective awareness and attention about this right now. And I also believe that there is an arc of justice, and that now is the time to really push forward with that. If not us, then who?
Yeah, beautiful. Well said. We are the ones we've been waiting for, right? I mean, yes, well said. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom, the gracefulness by which you talked about your learnings and unlearnings. I know it's bumpy, and you make it feel welcoming for all of us to show up in the journey in the ways that we are. So I super appreciate both of you sharing this time and space with us and encouraging us to feel it and be it and just keep trying. And so with that, I think we're concluding this part of our panel today, and I'm grateful again, and thank you both, Emily and Marisa. Onwards, yes, onwards. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Be well, you two. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you so much, Bina, for facilitating that important conversation. And thank you to Emily and Marisa. I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to witness such a powerful conversation from amazing women. So thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nancy Maldonado, and it is my honor to be here. I want to thank, obviously, the City of San Diego and the Nonprofit Institute for the invitation and really for the work that you do to uplift our nonprofit sector. So before I tell you a little bit about myself, I want to take this opportunity to introduce a dear friend and someone who truly embodies equity in action every day. So it's my pleasure to share this morning with Dr. Roxanne Kymaani. Thank you, Roxanne, for being here this morning. Can you please just share with everyone a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here. I have a business, Kymaani Catalyst Consulting, and the work that I do really focuses on supporting people to just be better humans in the world with a social justice and equity lens. And so I do a lot of that work here in San Diego with Rise San Diego. I'm a faculty member there. And then I'm also a professor for a couple of different universities. And then I just do quite a different bit of trainings and workshops and dialogue facilitation focused on helping people be better human beings.
Thank you. And you downplay that, but you are a powerhouse and you do some amazing work. So it really is my honor to share this platform with you this morning. So like I said, I'm Nancy Maldonado, and I am the president and CEO of Chicano Federation here in San Diego. So for those of you who maybe don't know too much about Chicano Federation, we are a 51-year-old nonprofit, and we focus on advocacy and social service programs throughout the entire county. So, you know, it's an honor to have the role that I do and to share with you a little bit about the work that we do today and also what it means for us, for equity in action every day, and what that means for the work that we do. So we wanted to kick it off today by talking a little bit about an op-ed that I recently wrote for the UT. And it was really talking about the nonprofit sector and how some of the practices that we hold in nonprofit really uphold systems of white supremacy. And, I get asked a lot why I decided to write that. And for those of you who haven't seen it, perhaps we can share the link in the chat box. I love that question, right? Because it speaks to kind of, what prompted me and what was going on when I wrote that. And so I'll share that it was probably about a year ago that I saw a title on an article, or maybe it was a post, and it had that very title, that nonprofit perpetuates white supremacy. And my instinct was, my first reaction was to get offended, right? Because I work in nonprofit. And what I have learned about myself is that anytime I have kind of a strong visceral reaction to something, it's obviously triggering something in me. And so I sat with it and I thought about it, and I went back to that article, and then I started looking up more articles and kind of doing some of the work to understand why that really was kind of such a triggering line for me. And one of the quotes that I read that really stood out to me was that you can't lift people up by putting them down. And it hit me that in the nonprofit industry, a lot of the language that we use and a lot of the practices that we hold operate off that deficit mindset of talking about people in terms of needing to be fixed. And to be honest with you, there was times where it was kind of a gut punch to me to realize that I myself played a role in perpetuating some of these systems and some of these practices. And then the more that I thought about it and the more that I looked into it, I thought, gosh, first, of course, I need to do the work internally. And we've done a lot of work at Chicano Federation to move in the direction of not upholding those systems, not using that language. But then I really felt it was the right time to kind of share those thoughts with others. And I'm grateful to the response has been very positive, and people really commending me for writing that and for calling some of those practices out. And so, Roxanne, you also, do a lot of work in nonprofit, obviously with Rise, and you read the piece. Any kind of reactions or responses?
Yes, absolutely. And I've read it a few different times, trying to come at it from different lenses. And I think the piece that it really speaks to is the notion of, what I think people forget is that the reasons nonprofits exist is because of systems of white supremacy. That the reason we have nonprofits is to support communities because of these oppressive systems. And that article really kind of puts that into play. But the other piece that you really brought forward with it was, just as you said, speaking to how we all kind of collude in that. We perpetuate those systems and participate in those systems through the language that we use, through, the way that we speak about community, and just the automatic social construction that we have around communities that need support and need help. And we focus predominantly on that disadvantagedness rather than looking at progress, looking at success, looking at the power that shows up in community, and quite frankly, what community actually means. It's not simply just a neighborhood that we live in. It's the people, it's the friendships, it's the neighbors, it's the families. And a lot of that gets left out because we assume we have to focus on what the needs are. And those needs are typically viewed through a white savior complex of what we think a community needs. And, the article really put that into perspective of trying to hold everyone accountable for the way that they show up, that we each have a responsibility for our own behavior, our own thoughts, and our own actions.
No, I think you said it perfectly. And I think that where a lot of the work lies is on looking at how we personally uphold those systems, right? Because even as a woman of color, when I started analyzing the way that I wrote grants, right, it was feeding into that system of describing people as people who needed to be fixed. And I read this quote, another quote, in the work that I was doing, and it really stood out to me. And it's by Edgar Villanueva. And what he said is we need to put our money where our values are and use money to heal where people are hurting. And that really resonates with me, right? Like put the money where the hurt is, not the poverty, not the crime, not any of those other words that we sometimes use to describe people. Place the blame where it needs to be placed. And it is on the system, on the years of systemic oppression that has led us to where we are today. And let's start using those words and working to deconstruct these systems rather than kind of putting the blame on the communities that need our support. And so I go back to that quote a lot, and I think about it in terms of how we move forward, but how we can also work to almost like improve or change the practices that we use in nonprofit when talking about community.
Absolutely. I think the other piece too is spending more time looking at the variations in community that we do see and the way that we show up in those communities. That it's where are we spending our money? Are we supporting the communities in finding ways to help them? And even then, see, I even question the way that I'm talking about it too, because I participate in this same system. But looking at how we are individually defining community and showing up in those communities, even the ones that we choose to live in that represent us and our identity. And those wounds matter. I mean, each community has different wounds. And I think a lot of us tend to forget that the wounds that we have is part of why we show up and work in nonprofits, because we want to make a difference. That is also helping us try to figure out what we need to heal our own traumas and our own wounds.
I love that point that you just made. And I often think of, we help others to help ourselves, right? And I think that's true. I think that you touched on a really great point, is that trauma and that intergenerational trauma that exists and why we do the work that we do and what drives us to do the work that we do. But with that, saying that we all have a lot of room to continue to be better. And I love the point that you touched on a little bit earlier about asking community what they need, right? Not making these assumptions. And I think that's a lot of what is happening right now during the pandemic and the aid that's being sent into community. And I think there was a lot of assumptions about what people needed. And instead of just asking folks, right? And the way that it's being done in terms of providing things, when people really need financial assistance, to no fault of their own, they need financial assistance. And the reluctance in providing that and in entrusting people to make their own decisions for how they're going to spend the funds that are available to them was also something that caught me a little off guard. And maybe it shouldn't have, but it did. And I know that you and I have talked about that, right? And the respect that when we do our work and can be in a manner that's respectful and dignified of community.
Absolutely. I think there's another perspective too that adds to what you're speaking to is people who are conducting research. And even if they live in the community, just by virtue of becoming a researcher, they're putting on a different lens. And that is that outsider perspective, because you're coming in, you're having to be mindful of your own limitations, your own assumptions that can come with that. And there's been a lot of research or support that people think that they're doing in communities that has really caused damage, has created laws and policies historically that have been rooted in white supremacy, that have been rooted in racism. And, one of the things to look at is why indigenous nations have their own institutional review boards now, because historically, the work that has happened within their tribes or nations, depending on which country you're in, has been extremely detrimental to their communities in the assumptions of what they need and separating families. And, we're witnessing a lot of that now. But there's so much trauma that can happen through the notion of thinking we are helping. And one thing is, when I put on my professor hat and I'm working with students in their research and they come with these ideas of what they think the community needs, the first question I ask them is, who else have you asked? Because your opinion is just one, and you're looking at it through a researcher's lens, but people who are living day to day in that community may not see it the same way. And if you're trying to will upon them this thinking that they need this particular kind of support, you're doing a disservice.
100% agree. And along those lines, I will do a shameless plug for some of the work that I have done that we have done as a collaborative with 23 other nonprofits in the region. Is along those same lines, we went out and conducted over 4,000 surveys that were framed in the form of conversations with folks asking this very question: what is it that you need right now? What do you anticipate your biggest challenge will be in 6 months, in a year? So the data from that, or kind of the results, I don't want to call it data, but the results of those conversations are being released today. So I encourage anyone, if you want to hear how our community responded in terms of telling us what it is that are their priority needs right now, that information was released this morning. So we can also probably provide the link if anyone's interested. And so switching over a little bit, Roxanne, I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about allyship and what that means. And I see that word thrown out often. And I'd love to have a conversation about what it really means to be an ally, particularly to communities of color, to the Black Lives Matter movement. What does it mean to be an ally? Because I feel like that word has maybe been watered down a little bit.
Absolutely. And, I could be wrong. I believe the term ally really even was rooted in the LGBTQIA movement and people wanting to support that community. And it has since been used within the Black Lives Matter movement, or some people calling it the Black Liberation Movement as well. To me, there's different pockets, right? You have allyship, advocate, and accomplice. And that allyship is and let me back up, all three are helpful in their own way, but they're not the same thing. An ally might be somebody who puts, a sign on their lawn, reads a book, is trying to work towards their own individual learning, and may have some personal private conversations to grow. And there's some other bits and pieces to that as well. An advocate is somebody who takes it that step further and really, works in a more public manner to root out systems of oppression, works against those policies and tries to push new ways of thinking out there, and in some sense might risk their own self. Participating in protest perhaps is one way. And then you have the accomplice, which is a whole other level. Those are extreme risk takers, in the sense that, we see it in the protests that are happening when you have a line of white folks who are standing in front, standing in between people of color and the police force, to show that separation, to really put themselves there. The other piece that, I often like to think about too, that it's not so much just about going to the protest, but when you're sitting in those meetings at work in organizations and you see something happening that is, in some way, whether it's a subtle or an implicit attack on a person of color, that you take that opportunity to step up and speak out. You don't wait until after, maybe write an email or something, but you take that step and potentially risk losing your own job to support the work that needs to happen. And, while I said all three of these are extremely important, we need a lot more of the people who want to move into the advocacy, that want to move into accomplice. There's certainly a lot more coming into allyship, because a lot of people are awakening to this trauma of what we've seen over the last 6 months. But it's important to realize that this goes way before George Floyd, way before Breonna Taylor. There's this system of oppression is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the making. And it's going to take a lot more than just reading a book and changing your own thinking process. It's having those really hard, difficult conversations, putting yourself at risk, and calling it out when you see it. And that includes in your family, in your community, your city leaders, your organizations, you know, one thing that you and I have chatted about too, Nancy, which I think would be helpful, is when organizations focus on their mission. You were talking about how organizations center their mission in order to show up with this notion that they support Black Lives Matter. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. But I think that's where a lot of this work needs to happen. So yes, allyship is powerful, and there's still so much more work that needs to happen. That doesn't just mean go to a protest. Still do that, yes, but there's a lot more work that can happen elsewhere to start making those protests matter, so that what they're fighting for starts to really show up in our laws and in our policies.
No, you touch on some really great points. And so later on today, I'll talk about kind of the advocacy within a 501c3 and kind of what some of the constraints are, or what the perceived constraints are. But so you bring up a good point about centering the mission. So one of the things that I saw, and I'm sure you did, and probably a lot of people on this call or that are tuning in right now, when a few months ago, when we started seeing kind of a influx of statements from organizations, including nonprofits, about their support of Black Lives Matter. And yeah, you're right. We did see a lot of organizations center it around their mission, and understanding that wasn't what this was about. It's not about the nonprofit's mission. It's about showing up and supporting. But to your point, advocacy is more than what you feel. It's what you do. Right. And so I think that sometimes nonprofits can be reluctant because we're not sure, kind of how far can I go? How much advocacy can I do? What can I support? What can't I support? And there might be some kind of hesitation to do some of the work. But I think what I would encourage nonprofits to do, or kind of some of what I witnessed, and maybe you can speak more to this, is a statement of support without tangible actions of what that support entailed and what was going to change, or what steps each nonprofit was going to take to advance equity within their own nonprofit. Because as you know, just because we're nonprofits doesn't mean that we are places where different people want to work, right? So it's one thing to encourage diversity. It's another thing to be a diverse, friendly workplace. So, kind of touching on that, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add in terms of kind of the statements that you saw, or the response from nonprofits, since we do have a lot of nonprofits listening.
Yes. It's interesting because a lot of the work that I've been doing with different organizations is helping them write those statements. And I've been pushing back on them to go, one, I'm not your PR person, so I shouldn't be the one that's writing this on your behalf. If you're the CEO, if you're the leader of this organization, you should be writing it from your perspective as the representation of the organization. And certainly, get people's feedback on it, but it makes it harder, and then it doesn't feel as authentic, and people can see right through that. If the language is not what employees or clients or customers are used to hearing coming from that particular person, they're going to notice it and they're going to call it out. And we've seen a lot of that happen with some of these organizations. I worked on one and told them it's important for you to just say that Black Lives Matter. And there was some pushback, like, well, I don't know if people are going to handle that. And it's like, why? Why are you so afraid to do that? What is getting in the way? And if you can't say that Black Lives Matter, then you're not for those lives mattering. And to me, it was simply put that way. And they still chose a different path on how they wanted to present those statements. But language matters, and people are looking at that. The other thing I think organizations, both nonprofit as well as corporate, is who are you partnering with? What are the statements that they are making too? Because where we partner is a representation. People are looking at the ways that those are connected and what those relationships mean. Where are you getting these particular services? All of those interconnections make a difference. There was another piece too that I heard a few weeks ago, when people are looking for new jobs and wanting to work within the nonprofit. They're looking at the boards. They're looking at what those individuals are saying in the community, trying to make a sense of what this organization really is, because it's more than just the mission. It's more than what we just put on our websites or put on our social media. It's who do you have on the board? How are they represented in the community? Where are they spending their individual dollars that isn't just about particular organizations? All of those kinds of things come into play when you're talking about making a powerful difference in, the advocacy work that we need. All of those pieces come into play. This isn't, just silos. They're all interconnected, and that's where change happens. And I would take it a step further, that we need more than just change. We need transformation, because that is where the key to unlocking our community's potential, our country's potential, and further the globe.
You touched on a good point, which I think is relevant to the nonprofit, is who you're partnering with and who your funders are, right? I mean, for so long, we've been in this mindset of, gosh, we just have to take what we can get, right? Because we're all operating, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of us are operating on such thin margins that a lot of the times we have subscribed to that. And I know that for us, this is the first year that we actually gave money back, because it was an organization that we chose to no longer align ourselves with. And it was a little scary, right, to refund that check. But I felt like it was important to really put into action what we say we're about. And so I think that's another topic and a discussion for nonprofits is, who are you taking money from? And are these organizations really reflective of your mission and really aligning with the work that you do or the vision that you have for our communities? And if they're not, do we really want to take these funds? And I know it's a hard decision, because trust me, I kind of agonized over it for days. But I think it's an important step in moving forward in saying that, no, we're not going to take money from a corporation that treats their employees really bad and it has a reputation of discrimination against people of color, and then take their money and make them look like heroes because they're quote unquote helping people of color. And I see that play out a lot. And I know that might probably not sit well with people or be a little uncomfortable, but I really think that we need to start thinking about that too.
Absolutely. It's the consequences. It might be a short-term win. It might be a short-term win to take that money and what that money might be able to do, but what is the long-term consequence to the community? What's the long-term consequence to the organization in what that money can really represent? Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I think we have another important topic that we wanted to touch on. So something that I've heard, and it's kind of along the lines of allyship where we started, but there's been a lot of conversations about what about us from other groups.
Yes.
We suffer from police brutality too. We suffer from racism as well. We have a long history of discrimination. What about us? And I think it's an important conversation that we start having in how, the intersectionality of how this intersects with the Black community, with the Latino community, with all different communities. And I think, Roxanne, you and I, when we spoke, you made an excellent point that if we help advocate for all of the things that Black Lives Matter is for, the trickle-down effect will benefit all communities. And that if people could take the time to understand what this movement is about, that we would understand that we don't need Brown Lives Matter hashtag. We don't need anything along those lines. But that's not to say that we can't still talk about the inequities that other communities are also experiencing. But I think that there's some conversations to be had about how this all comes together. And I think that you when you and I talked about it, you brought up some really great points. So I'd love for you to share those.
Yeah, I think, the piece for this is the notion of what are we centering? Do we have to put ourselves first in order for Black Lives to matter? And so there's a lot of argument against when you see protest signs that say Latinos for Black Lives, Asians for Black Lives. It's centering one particular community in front of the other. And the Black Lives Matter movement is not just about police brutality against Black lives. They are not just saying stop killing Black people, but everything else is okay. when we talk about police reform or we talk about defunding the police, it's for all communities, because we know communities of color have a serious impact. In what we're paying attention to right now is the focus on Black lives, because that is what we are seeing so much of. Now, it's not to say that other folks aren't having the same violence put against them in the community, but this is the focus in order for that transformation to happen. And so it becomes harder when we, as you talked about, when we use those whataboutisms. No one in the Black Lives Matter movement that I'm following, I would say, would go, well, we're just focusing on us, we'll come to you later. That's not what this is about. This movement is about systems of oppression, the system of white supremacy that has been rooted in racism across this country for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's impacted various communities, and not just communities of color. The communities, LGBTQIA communities as well, has, a huge system of oppression that work against them. We have a president who's taking away rights across this country for that impact. And so it's where we need to focus is a movement that is liberation for all people of color. And right now that is called the Black Lives Matter movement. So the centering of other folks can still be included within that, because there is no separation when we're trying to fight this oppression. And, there's a point that you brought up when we were talking about this too, about, what was the Chicano community doing in the 60s and the 70s? What was the Black community doing? They were trying to fight it in various ways, in different ways, but here we are in 2020, and we're still having that same fight. So what is it that we all collectively need to change? Should we continue to try to separate these movements, or do we want to have one that is fighting for equity for all?
Absolutely. I make the point of, I believe so much in the work that I do, because I hope that, so 51 years ago, Chicano Federation, like to your point, Roxanne, was started to advocate for the community around some of these same issues. So police brutality, voting rights. And my hope in the work that we're all collectively doing is that 51 years from now, my son won't be fighting against these same systems, right? And so really looking at, gosh, we are so much stronger together, and we are fighting against the same system that wasn't built for us, right? And so, I'd love to start having that conversation around it's okay to bring up issues that the Latino community is experiencing, or other communities, without the what about us isms or the us too, right? We know that. And so, I look forward to kind of, a better alignment of these movements, because I think collectively we could be so powerful. And I think that nonprofits can play a very pivotal role in this work. And moving forward. And I love the conversations that are happening. I mean, the very fact that we're here today, you and I, Roxanne, because Roxanne and I have these conversations online, but when we were invited to just have a conversation this morning, that's completely unscripted, by the way. We were so excited, we get to talk about this in front of people, just, what we can say whatever we want. So that was pretty exciting. And just so the fact that we're even able to do this, I think, speaks a lot to where we are moving as a nonprofit industry. But we're so strong, especially here in San Diego, that I would love to see us take it even further, because I think that the nonprofit industry has the power to drive this change in San Diego. And I'm excited to be part of it. I'm excited to be part of it during this time, because, gosh, this is our call to action. This is our moment. And so, how are we going to address it? How are we going to stand up to this? Because we can't maintain status quo, and we can't go back to status quo, right? I hear a lot of people talking about the pandemic and going back to quote unquote normal. Normal wasn't working. Normal wasn't working for our communities. We cannot go back to normal. And so I think that everyone kind of listening, I think if I were to offer maybe a takeaway, I would say, how can you be a disruptor? How can we collectively disrupt and not go back to normal? And what that means for each organization specifically, but for each person. So Roxanne, if there were any takeaways or kind of things that you would encourage people to think about, especially within the nonprofit industry, what would that be?
It's a great question, and I could probably talk about that in a dialogue for an hour of just trying to answer that. I think letting go of what we perceive to be normal. There's something that I often say is this notion of let go to let come. What do we need to let go of in order for something else to arrive, for something else to show up within our consciousness or within our collective consciousness? It wasn't just COVID that started this pandemic. We have other pandemics that are going on within our communities that if we were to go back to normal, think about what the consequence of that is too. What are we bringing back? If we focus forward and start to think about what can normal now be, what can our future look like, that's what we need to focus on. There's a lot more change that needs to happen. There's a lot more energy that needs to go into demanding action and holding people accountable, like I said earlier, holding our city leaders accountable. Think about who your city council members are. How are they being represented? How are they really showing up in the community? Have you seen them? If not, why not? Ask them for that change. There's another question that I saw pop up in the box around, what can board members do better to transform their organizations, and, how board diversity is important. And yes, it absolutely is, but we don't want to just diversify boards for the sake of diversifying so that we can show up better on our websites. There's people who are people of color who are also still working against this system. Why? Because we all collude in this notion of white supremacy. So you want to be mindful about who you are placing on the board, what they represent. Does your board actually show a representation of the communities that you are claiming to serve? If you are an organization that focuses entirely on youth, do you have somebody who represents that youth, meaning somebody who's in that age group who can speak to that? Those kinds of people need to be on that place, and be able to speak their voice. Are boards doing some deeper internal work within? We all participate in board retreats. Are you doing anything in those retreats that is allowing you to call attention to your own individual self-transformation? This isn't just about transforming the board, it's also about transforming us as individuals, because the way that we show up in the world obviously begins with us. What is the ways that I'm thinking that is causing me to speak a certain way when I'm representing these different groups? What do I need to change in order for people to see the impact that I think I am trying to make? This notion of intent versus impact is huge and matters. And so board diversity goes beyond just simply, oh, we need a Black person on this board, or we need a Chicano person on this board. There's so much more representation that happens when you think about what boards need to look like and what actions that they need to take. And it might be, hard for some boards to go, it's time for somebody to go, that this person is no longer serving the best interest of the community because the communities are demanding transformation. And if an organization can't do that, then they're not going to be successful, because the community is going to determine what that success looks like.
So I know that some of the questions pop up, but then they disappear for us. I don't know if there's a way. I want to make sure that we are able to address people's questions, but we can't see them all. I just want people to know that we're not intentionally not answering questions. They pop up and then they disappear. What actions can board members take to affect real transformation within their organizations? Oh yeah. So I think, is this the one that you already addressed? So I think you bring up a great point, is that don't diversify just for the sake of diversifying, right? And making sure that the people who you are selecting to your boards really align in. And I think within that too, Roxanne, you and I did a panel about women on boards and commissions. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I would also encourage people to do when you're looking at who to put on your board is to give a board seat to, when all things being equal, Obviously, I'm a champion for women, so I'm always going to advocate for more female representation everywhere. But also, if all things being equal, a woman of color, there is usually a story of resilience and perseverance that might not be obvious on that resume. And so, kind of encouraging people to stop evaluating just by words, just by resumes, and really getting to know people and asking them the tough questions about how they align with your vision and your mission. Because to be honest, I've stopped looking at resumes and just started having conversations with people when they apply for a position, because I think there's a story there to hear, and there's a real person behind that might not be really exemplified on a piece of paper. Let's see, what is normal? And does anyone still believe in healthy boundaries and not pacifying? What is normal? That is a great question. That's a great question. So when we say, and I hear it a lot, like, I can't wait to return to normal. I can't wait for this pandemic is over so we can get back to normal. And so I think it goes back to really redefining what that normal will look like, or what it can look like, right? Which is a lot of the conversations that are happening right now of reimagining this world that we could live in. I was asked a question that honestly, I was speechless, and I'm usually never speechless. My team's listening, so they can attest to that. But I was asked the question, what would a world without racism look like? And to be honest with you, I couldn't even answer that, right? Because it's so ingrained and embedded in what we do. And I've sat with that question for a while. And so I would encourage maybe everyone to think about that. What would a world without racism look like for you? So again, I think we're about out of time. I want to just really, Roxanne, thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and for agreeing just to come on here and just talk. I think the world of you and the work that you do, and I'm just so grateful to know you and to be on this journey with you. So thank you for being here. Thank you again for the invitation to speak to the City of San Diego, to USD, to the Nonprofit Academy. Thank you for hosting this forum, and really for being open to moving in this direction and having these conversations, and maybe being a little uncomfortable. And again, to anyone who had questions, we're so sorry we were not able to see them for very long. So if there's anything that Roxanne and I can share with you, or any questions you'd like to follow up on, we're happy to do that. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome back, Nancy. I'm Dr. Roxanne. Really, really appreciate what you said there. And actually, all five powerful women. We thought that this was so important that we wanted to kick our day off with this. Conversations that must be had, but also the conversations that aren't happening outside of individual rooms. So now that we're glad to make sure that we put this forward. I thank you all for staying with us. Again, we still have a very, very exciting day. The importance of what you just heard is key here. The first thing is that many of us think, okay, well, this is going to happen. This is taking place right now, and people will fight for this. It's actually going to take all of us, every one of us, to really not allow this time period to pass us by. Right? There are people who, I like the way that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, there are people who are protectors of the status quo. Right? Individuals out there who like to keep things the exact same way that they are. Well, you know what? I'll tell you this, that if we hope things get better, it's not going to work. Hope is not a strategy. We have to have this intentionality in everything we do if we like to see the change. And the decisions, what we say and what we do right now, could have a long-lasting impact, not only in our lifetimes, but for generations to come. So I thank you, ladies, for being so open and honest and sharing. Many times, in order to put an event on like this, it takes a lot. And I just want to spend this time thinking Finest City Entertainment, City's Finest Entertainment, for their work here. Also, Taylor, Tom, Cynthia from the Nonprofit Institute, and Michelle Morano from the Economic Development Department, and all the other support systems that we have in place to allow this event to be as successful as it is. I think it's important for us to realize what are some key factors that are going to allow us all to get the best out of the Academy. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that now. We can watch it, we can say this is good, but I'm actually going to give you some key points here that are going to be really, really important for us to get the most effective day from this. So the first thing I would like to say is that I love Bina's point about reflections. Thinking about it as you attend these sessions. What did you learn? What did you unlearn? What can you apply? Right? I think reflections is a leadership principle. What did you learn? What did you unlearn? What can we apply? So if you're thinking about that, it talks about, and then you can put it into action, and it talks about this level of intentionality. So also want to talk about those people who want to talk about how can we continue this work? Well, there's opportunities that we have available, right? So next week, starting next week on September 15th, for several Tuesdays in a row, we'll talk about this Fortify workshop series in which we will have the opportunity for people to talk about racial equity. It's a racial equity specific series in addition to other topics, but initially we're going to start with that. So that's a great opportunity. And then we also have our annual State of Nonprofits and Philanthropy Summit. That's going to be held on October 29th. And with that one, we actually have the opportunity to get our national, our local data that we use and many nonprofits use in their grants and in their request, because the data is so powerful. We believe that we are the holders of that data, and one of our responsibilities is to publish that data, but get it into the hands of the decision makers. So we'll get that. Many of you would have received an email yesterday that went out that talks about the leadership survey. So in order for us to get an idea of what's going on, we asked and survey our community. So if because you're part of this and you signed up for this, you're now on our email distribution list. So we'll go ahead and send that out to you. And then lastly, we get Governance Symposium is held in January 2021. We hold it every January. It's a 2-day event. We're talking about governance, nonprofit leadership, and boards. It's very, very exciting. And for those of you who love governance, this is going to be a great opportunity. And for those of you who need something to do on a Friday night, curling up next to a set of bylaws is probably one of the best things that you can do to spend your Friday night. Okay, just kidding. So I will talk about how are you going to get the best out of the summit. So the first thing, these are my 5 points to get the best out of the Academy. Number 1, be alert, right? Be aware of what's happening. Be aware of what's going on. Be aware of what's being said and also what's not being said. Point number 2, speak up. I see so many people in the chat box right now sharing and talking and making connections. So these are really, really important, right? I believe that if I say something, sometimes people say, oh, that's a good point, but it makes someone think of something else. So feel free to use this open, protected space to share your thoughts and to be able to get some feedback from others. The other thing is it's at your own pace, right? So this will be recorded. The last one we did several months ago is recorded as well. So making sure that this can be done at your own pace. We have an on-demand series that has several videos of stuff that we believe that nonprofit leaders can use at this time. Right? We have conversations about strategy, conversations about leadership principles. What does it mean to be an adaptive leader? So we have some great discussions on that. That's going to be, you can access that with a link that we have embedded in this platform. And you can take a look at that also. It's also available on the Nonprofit Institute's website. Also here, think about it as this is just like a regular conference, it's an opportunity for you to meet others. Right? I believe the people that I've been talking to and what I've been hearing, nonprofit leaders are saying, it's good to know that we're just not alone in this. Right? We are not alone in this. So in order to know that you're not alone in this, you still have to make connections with others who may feel that they're alone in this. All right? We get through this because we can do it together. I like what the video said at the beginning there. It says much of our best work is done in the storm. So there's weathering the storm, and then there's the nonprofit community that does their best work within the storm. So I think that we have that opportunity to collaborate, work well with each other, and figure out ways to address the needs that sometimes are not being met by other sectors or or people are unable to meet by themselves. And then the next one here is be nosy, right? Ask questions, think about other people, look at other organizations, look up their websites, find information out there. This is your time to say, hey, what is it? I think one of the challenges with nonprofits often at times is we're so insular. Things are going on in our community so much that we don't look outside. So this is our opportunity to look outside. So be nosy. You have full authority to go out there and be your own private detective, but look at the research, look at the data, look what's out there. This is the first time. So if anybody tells you, oh, this is what we're supposed to do during these times, this is unprecedented. So everything's out there, every idea, every suggestion, and we need it from you. Nobody knows your job better than you do, right? It's not about surviving this. How do we get stronger on the other side? Every time in history of America, when events like this happen at this magnitude, we do never go back to being the same. So for those that are holding on, waiting for things to get back to the same, it will not happen, right? So we have to figure out, how do we emerge stronger? What do we need to do to be adaptive? What do we need to do to think about our strategy, right? Perfect. And then this one right here this is our bonus point, right? The bonus point is you pay this forward. This is available on YouTube as soon as we finish today, immediately following. Send this to people who need to hear this information. Send it to people who you know need to have a detailed conversation. You tell them, hey, if you turn to 10 minutes in 25 seconds, you need to hear this information. Send it to your staff. Use it as opportunities at the beginning of a staff meeting to say, hey, everybody, we want you to watch this short video. Come in and let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. What does this mean for our organization? What does this mean for our community? So it's a bonus point to say, what can we do essentially to move things forward in a right way? So I think that this platform, being on YouTube, is incredible. We'll use it today so it can simulate as much as possible a real life conference. So what you'll see after my time here, you'll see that different rooms will open up. And as these rooms open up, you'll be able to go into different rooms at different times and be able to access different speakers. And in the chat features in the boxes, we'll provide you some information that tells you what's going on. We also have access to all the handouts that you'll hear today. Nancy's going to be joining us shortly here, also late a little bit in the afternoon, and she's going to talk about advocacy and what it means. I often look at the news, local news, and we see her on there representing the Chicano Federation and figuring out ways to advocate. I appreciate what she's doing. I look forward to it. The article that she referenced, we have put the link, or at least be able to give you a place to access it, in the chat box as well. And then I'll also be doing something on strategy this afternoon also. So we have an exciting day planned for you. Right now, this is going to be our first break. We'll take breaks throughout the day. All right. So we'll take 10-minute breaks in between our sessions. We'll do that at lunchtime as well. We have a lunchtime plenary, which is going to be some powerful discussions on reaching our community. And then we have a great afternoon plan. And coming back from the afternoon, we have a very, very special surprise for you. So make sure you stay tuned for that. We're excited about this, the first time that we've done it in the Nonprofit Academy. And then lastly, for those of you who need to take a breather and get prepared for what's going to happen for the rest of the day, we have Loretta Turner, a local nonprofit person who's also a coach and a yoga instructor. She's going to do some mindfulness exercise for us for about 3 or 4 minutes. So for those of you who want to take a breather and join Loretta, she's incredible in what she does. And then enjoy the rest of your break, and we'll see you back here shortly. The countdown will be up there, and when we get back, we'll have some dynamic sessions for you. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to continuing seeing you today.
Thank you, Lynn and the Nonprofit Academy, for having me. Again, my name is Loretta Turner. I am a certified leadership coach, a certified yoga teacher, and a recent graduate of the Masters in Nonprofit Management and Leadership program at the University of San Diego. I'm also currently a full-time grant writer for the Burn Institute, a local nonprofit right here in San Diego. I'm thrilled to be spending a few minutes with you this morning. And I've been really thinking about the title of this academy, Building Resilience and Sustainability. And I've been wondering, what does it mean to be a resilient and sustainable professional, especially as a nonprofit professional during these uncertain times where it can feel like sometimes we're carrying the weight of the world. Now, to me, being resilient and sustainable means having the ability to strategically keep on keeping on, to keep moving forward. Now, this takes courage and this takes strength, but I also believe that this requires having the space and energy to be resilient and sustainable. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be offering a mindfulness practice and breathing technique that can offer you a little more space and energy so that you can better embody what it truly means to be resilient and sustainable. Now, the practice is called solar plexus breathing. And feel free to stay exactly where you are, whether you're seated or standing. All you'll need to do is make sure that you've got enough space to move your arm side to side like this with fingertips on your shoulders. Now I'm going to take a moment to demonstrate what this looks like first, and then we'll do it together for about 30 seconds, 40 seconds. Eventually, you're welcome to pick up the pace, and that'll help build more energy and create more space in the body. So again, just demonstrating what it looks like. When you inhale, you'll turn your torso one way, and you'll inhale through your nose. And on the exhale, you're just turning your torso the other way, but you're exhaling out your mouth. Again, slowly, it's inhale, rotating one way, breathing in through the nose, and you're twisting from your solar plexus, your torso area. And on the exhale, sighing out the mouth, twisting the opposite way. So we'll start it together. Again, about 30 seconds, starting slow, and then you're welcome to pick up the pace. Take a deep breath in, and a deep breath out, and let's begin. Inhale, and exhale. Inhale, and exhale. A little quicker. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Feel free to move quicker. About 10 more. Last one. Good. Coming to center. Relax the hands away from the shoulders. It might feel nice to roll those shoulders back. And then forward. Maybe roll the head around from one ear to the next. And then taking a moment to pause here and just observe if there's been any shift within the body as far as the amount of space that you feel like you have internally, or a shift in energy internally in your body now that you've just practiced this brief breathing exercise and mindfulness exercise. And feel free to take that with you for the rest of your day. Again, thank you all for having me. Lynn, back to you.